might as well start. Thanks everyone so much for coming. Very warm welcome to the October Gallery. I'm Mallory, I'm curator here at the gallery, and it's my great pleasure to also welcome Xanthi Summers.
Hello, hello.
And Guy Oswin.
Hi, thanks for coming.
Whose work you see around us. So Guy's works are the paintings over here, and Xanthi's are the ceramics over there in the corner. This talk will be roughly 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So as the talk's going on, have a think of good questions that you might want to ask. And yeah, let's get going. So this exhibition is called Material Sensibilities, and we're focusing on kind of artists, the mark of the artist's hand and kind of that interaction from the artist and their material. So Guy and Xanthi, your work both engage with this. Guy, your works combine painting with sculptural elements, and Xanthi with your dynamic ceramics works as well. I wanted to start with, it'd be great if you could outline how you both began. How did you start your kind of artistic journey? So yeah, Guy, I don't know if you want to start us off.
Sure. First of all, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for everybody at October. It's been a fantastic show, very impressed with the curation and everything. So just in terms of how I got started, I was always quite artistic when I was younger anyway, and my painting practice was quite figurative. And then maybe in the last 10 years or so, it's become quite abstracted, been more interested in looking at contrast in the work. And it started off being contrast in terms of light and dark and colour. And after a little while realised that contrast didn't necessarily have to come from the pigment itself and could be more about the material that we're using or textures. And I was always a very texture-loving child and teenager and adult as well. You know, when you just like the feel of something, or when you're going shopping, you just want to touch everything. And so texture became a natural sort of progression to bring into the work. And looking at how other people use texture, often it was things like sand or metal and things like that as a substrate for painting. So initially, I started looking at using those things in the work, mainly as something to paint on top of. And that kind of over time and pushing it further and further into what I could do to get as far away from traditional oil paint as I could was concrete, which sounds a bit mental, to be honest with you. And initially it was just painting on the concrete. So I would pour out slabs of concrete and then use oil paint to paint on top. So I was using them effectively instead of a canvas. But after a while, realised that what was interesting to me was less about the paint on the concrete and actually more about the paint next to the concrete. So the contrast between the two. And just contrast being the interest mainly because of the ideas of sort of belonging or not belonging, which I'll go into a bit more detail in a bit, but just to keep that brief for your first question.
And when you were at art school, was this something that, because I imagine being in like the painting department, were they like, why is she bringing in concrete? Like, what's she doing? Is that something that your kind of lecturers were supportive of, or were you, because you studied at the RCA, right? And
yes,
you graduated. I wonder, that kind of moment when you're exploring materials, how did they guide you or support you, or
It was a bit of a mixed bag. Generally I really loved my time at the RCA, so I just finished there last August, so not that long ago. It was a great experience, probably actually one of the best things I've ever decided to do, if I'm honest, because it meant that sort of push into formalizing the practice a bit more and understanding and learning how to critique work and talk about work. The reception to the concrete was largely encouraging, actually. I feel like most people were quite, maybe they just felt kind of intrigued by it. I don't know, sometimes you don't really know if people genuinely like it, but I suppose it doesn't really matter. It's more a case of, is it making them think something or asking a question of the work or why it's there. There were, obviously some people don't really get it, but that's also fine. And I think it's sort of strengthened my resolve in using something that is perhaps not a traditional method.
For sure. I think that's what's really like engaging actually about your works, is that you kind of see them from afar and then you're kind of thinking, oh, what is that? And like you're really drawn in to this kind of chasm in the middle of the canvas, and then your eye kind of dances onwards from there as well. And Xanthi, your beginnings.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone for being here and for having us. I am Zimbabwean, so I grew up in Zimbabwe until I lived there until about age 18. And Zimbabwe was a very interesting place to grow up. It was under dictatorship. We had 90% unemployment. It was, we had violent land reform there. But I grew up in a very privileged little bubble, which was incredible, and I was always very creative, but it took leaving Zimbabwe to kind of understand the context of what was happening in the country and the problems that exist there. And I think everything that I do with my art practice now is trying to understand my role as a white Zimbabwean and the histories that go along with that. So I went to South Africa and I went to the Michaela School of Fine Art and mostly did painting and printmaking, never did anything with ceramic. But the thing that inspired me the most when I was there were the Rhodes Must Fall protests that happened. So I think they swept through most of the world, but the Rhodes Must Fall while I was there were re-examining the kind of institutional frameworks, educational frameworks within the university that I was at, but also in terms of the public spaces, so the sculptures that were erected. And, at the front of the university, there was a huge monument of Cecil John Rhodes, and there was a big calling for that all to change. And I think the thing I learned the most was just, to open your eyes to all of that and the change that needed to happen. But interestingly enough, in Zimbabwe, this change wasn't positively seen at all within the white community. It kind of, because of the violent land reform that happened there, it kind of caused more of a segregation. And I was very interested to understand why that was and why the community that I belonged to was pulling away from more understanding, more acceptance, and that kind of thing. So I decided to come to London, and I studied a master's in post-colonial culture, which I loved. It was very deep, very interesting, but I think I am inherently a creative person, so I needed something that was, to do with my hands, that was practical. So I just joined a pottery studio where I could just go for a few hours a week to, just assuage my creative self. And it just became this really therapeutic place where I could go to university all day, then go to the pottery studio, and it just turned into a place where what I was learning was informing what I was creating with clay, and what I was creating with clay started to reflect everything that I was learning. And when it came to the end of my master's program and I needed to decide if I was going to carry on in academia or if I was going to, go into a museum, the thing that I found that was working the best for me was the combination of the post-colonial culture that I was so interested in and trying to work with clay as a medium to create narrative and dialogue and confront that. So that's how I kind of came to clay.
Great. And as you've been working with clay as a medium, was there any kind of particular point in your career that you feel like was a turning point, maybe in terms of scale, or something you tried out that went in a different direction? Or
completely. I think at the beginning when I first opened the studio, you're so nervous that you have to make money or cover the costs of the studio. So I gave myself 3 days a week where I thought I'd make things that people would like to buy, and then 2 days a week where I'd make things that I wanted to make, and quite quickly realized that the things that I wanted to make were so much more successful, got so much more interest, were just because they were authentic and they came from a place of exploration as opposed to a place of thinking about the end person or the, I was leading them through like a consumerist idea, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, because I've seen in some of your like earlier works that was all more of kind of like, I guess, domesticated objects, these like lamp forms or
exactly,
vase, things like that.
Yeah, so I think learning that not to fall into that trap of thinking about the end, where it's going to be in someone's house or something like that was just such a good lesson early on.
Yeah, nice. And Guy, have you always been drawn to painting specifically? Did you ever kind of experiment with other materials prior to your kind of like masters, I guess?
I was largely interested in painting. I have some like air dry clay at home, which every now and then I'll work with, but I'm terrible at it. Terrible. I think I maybe need some guidance from Xanthi, to be honest. But no, generally painting, when, early days, I feel like when you're sort of the gateway drug to painting tends to be, some sketching and things like that.
Yeah, sure.
But generally painting has my heart, I think.
Yeah. And maybe now you could also kind of unpack a little bit of what your work kind of, how do you convey the messages through your work? Because with abstract pieces, obviously people can bring their own interpretation to them, but there is a kind of key messages that you kind of put across as well.
Yeah, of course. So my work is mostly concerned actually with ideas of belonging, or I guess not belonging is more probably the phrase. Just for a bit of background as well, so my dad is Jamaican, just sitting there in the front row. Shout out. And my mum is British but lives in West Africa, and I grew up in Plymouth, which is down in Devon, for anyone who knows it. It's or doesn't know, I suppose. It's quite an undiverse area. So I think when I was growing up, I'm well into my 30s now. I think in retrospect I can kind of understand that I was a little bit lonely. Because of the lack of diversity there, you're kind of, there's not necessarily, well, sometimes it's explicit, but usually there's an implicit lack of belonging, but nothing that's usually direct. And so now I can recognize that there was always a bit of a longing for feeling that kind of home or place of safety, I suppose. So the work in itself, the reason I like the contrast, I think, because I'm looking at the idea of this binary, like between two things. So it's basically placing something that is perhaps seen as ugly or brutal or read in a different way into something that is traditionally thought of as a beautiful thing, or more into the historical canon in terms of background, I suppose, if you're looking at it like that. There's a filmmaker, this is a bit of a niche reference, but there's a filmmaker called Sergei Eisenstein, and he developed this Soviet montage theory, which is effectively he termed it collision of shots, and it's effectively where, say, as an example, you'd have one bit of film that showed a baby in a cradle, perhaps being rocked or sleeping or something like that, and then in the next separate piece of film, you might have a lion just strolling around. Individually, the two of them, have their own meanings. So the baby, you might be thinking about protection or love or family or, that kind of thing. And the lion, you may read as majestic or, beautiful or, but if you montage the two together and you've got sort of flicking back between the lion and the baby, you then create almost like a theoretical kind of third space of meaning where you are then reading it very, very differently. So it might be that you then are thinking of fear or urgency or,
protection.
So it reads very differently, and I think it's that concept or the idea of using two very opposing things and deriving a different meaning from the relationship between the two and not the individual components is what really interests me. So it's maybe less about the concrete as an object per se and the painting as an object, and more about the tension between the two that I personally derive meaning from. And that meaning is, I suppose, up to the viewer. But for me, it is like it's the meaning of its in and of itself, in that there's something sitting in between things that doesn't perhaps belong.
But then you also, there is that tension there between the two mediums, but then you also have kind of married them so well that you almost don't realize it as well. So that very much that margin, like the in-between, I guess, the margin. Yeah,
and it's interesting because the idea of putting something... okay, so this is saying concrete is ugly, but really I'm just commenting on our sort of, from an aesthetic standpoint, often concrete and stone and rock and things like that, unless they're carved into something smoothed. There's actually a book called Saving Beauty. This might be a good read for anyone I don't know, but it's talking about the aesthetics of the smooth and how we kind of see smoothness as synonymous with beauty, even for, it's directed mainly at sort of commercial things like cars and clothes and things like that. But anyway, it's something to think about. but the idea that you can then put something that is inherently perhaps unattractive into something that is beautiful, then it challenges how are you seeing the whole thing? Like, is the whole thing then ugly because it's got something ugly in it, or is the whole thing beautiful because the beauty is outweighing the ugliness? If something can be something but its constituent parts are different things, where does that, how are you then judging it? So it's just, sorry, that was a bit of a...
No, I love it, because I think that's also what I really engage with in your works, is that you it does send you into this almost contemplative state where you're kind of asking yourself questions whilst you're kind of also looking at the kind of beauty of it as well, and everything in between. We'll unpack a bit more of that. And Xanthi, on the kind of continuation of the post-colonial themes with your work, how do you integrate this into your practice? I know that's a big question. And
I think clay in general is such a great medium to use when you're talking about the past, because it's something that we've all interacted with. It's, the ground that we walk on. It's domestic. It's a mass-made mug that you buy from the supermarket, or the plate that you eat off, or the bricks that build your house, but it's also fine china, or it's, something that's worth a lot of money. And all of these things are, the value that we perceive within the clay is because of the narrative that we add to it and the meaning that we give to it. And I think when you use clay as a medium and you change, similarly how you want to change the dynamic between two different things, by bringing clay out of the domestic or changing the way you think about it, you can reference all the histories that clay's been a part of, but you can bring it into a new, think about it in a different way when you add new narrative and new discourse to it. So I think with using something, when I think about domesticity within the Global South, clay is a great medium to use for that. And I think it's also by changing the way you think about, so making it bright, or changing the scale, or thinking about, so these two pieces here are part of a larger series of work called Invisible Hand that look at invisible labor within the Global South, and they reference basket weaving and women's work, so things such as stitching, weaving, mending, textile work, which is extremely undervalued in the Global South. And I think when you're juxtaposing between the traditional and the modern, and you're looking at how to bring things of the past and make them contemporary. And I think, trying to blend the two and make you think about something in a different way is quite a good way to try and talk about topics that are quite heavy, which most of post-colonial culture is. So that's why I use a lot of bright color. It's almost like humans or bees were drawn to bright color. You feel a bit safe with it. The shapes feel quite safe, and it's something that we know. It's something, a vessel is something we all recognize and we can think about. But when you change the scale or the size, the meaning or the purpose or the fact that these aren't functional, they've got holes in them, I think you're able to then stay with it a bit longer, think about it a bit more deeply, but you've felt safe enough to come into the discourse and the conversation.
And then with your works, the way you actually make them, so this kind of like hand coiling technique, that's fairly kind of traditional-esque, but then you kind of disrupt it with each piece as well. Yeah,
so I think weaving in Zimbabwe is very important. So there's an area in Zimbabwe called the Binga region, and it's known for women's basketry there. But in Zimbabwe, during colonial rule in kind of 1950s and 1960s, Lake Kariba was built, and that was built to create electricity, which was to run all the British Empire, British infrastructure and farmland and mining and everything. But it displaced about 60,000 people in that region. So basketry, hard word, has kind of fallen by the wayside, and I think it's kind of trying to bring traditions back into the contemporary. And in Zimbabwe especially, I think there's still this aesthetic of, you either want to see deep, dark, tribal Africa, or you want to see this colonial explorer aesthetic. But I think when you reference traditional things such as the weaving, I think you can think about a more contemporary aesthetic and how to make it modern and create this new space where you're not held to these ideas of the past.
Yeah, like bringing into a new conversation about it.
Yeah. And weaving in general is such a good way to speak about social cohesion or lack thereof. What are we weaving together? What's been left out? What's in the fray? What are you creating in the tapestry of the narratives we're bringing together. So I think in general it's just a great way to speak about so many things you can pull together.
Yeah. And you said these works are kind of part of a series. Do you find that you create kind of 6 works or X many works around one topic, and then or other works are kind of one individual piece on a particular theme or a particular
No,
moment?
I definitely prefer the deep dive. So you make a body of work and you get super invested and you do a lot of research and you read a lot of books and you just get really involved in the things that you're talking about. And I find then you end up producing so much more work that's so much better than if you just did one and stop there. You kind of start and keep going, and it keeps developing, and the idea progresses. So I way prefer to make a body of work.
Yeah. And so this series of Invisible Hand, which kind of focuses on women's work, and this was also you did a residency, correct? If you could talk a bit about that and also unpack that link a little bit further, if you like.
Yeah, so I did a residency in South Africa this year where I went and did 2 months, and they had great big kilns and facilities, and I could spend a lot of time. This is where kind of developing all these ideas around weaving and women's work. And it's just more of an extension of what I was just speaking about looking at weaving as a metaphor and for social cohesion.
Mm. And yeah, no, I think that's what's also, what you can't see here is, so these are actually quite small compared to Xanthi. Some of her other works are kind of a meter tall.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So these are the small scale ones.
Yeah, I love working big, and I think it's such a nice way of also that challenge of trying to make something that's a vessel that's usually like a small vase and then make it massive, and you think about it further.
Yeah. And then I think what's really interesting with your work, what you were saying earlier about these kind of use of bright colors, is that there's this like playful interaction that brings people in, but then also a kind of a heavier message to it. I don't know if you wanted to kind of say a bit more on that.
Yeah, so usually, like I was saying, is that I'm trying to draw people. You don't want them to understand everything straight away or know what you're trying to talk about straight away, I think. And it's quite hard to find that balance between trying to lead people to be part of a deeper conversation without, making it too aggressive or scaring people off or just inviting the conversation. So I think that is why I generally use bright colors. It's also that kind of juxtaposition between the old and the new, the past and the present, bringing, traditional methods into the contemporary context. Yeah.
And do you still, on some of your works, I've seen you used to have kind of like phrases or almost they look like logos and things like that.
Yeah, so I've used, like Nike logos and things like that. So stuff that people recognize, again, was similar to like a vessel shape. It's something that you can see in the work and you understand, but when it's there with arms holding rocks and other materials and it's clay and it's sculptural, I guess it just generates more conversation. Yeah. Or to understand it, you need to sit with it longer, read a bit more about what's going on.
Sure. And you also I've read, I've not seen it, but some found materials as well. Sometimes you incorporate those.
Yeah, I think so. I'm a self-taught with clay, so I've never really been taught what I shouldn't do. So I think that's always been beneficial as well. So I've added rocks and stones and maize string and all sorts into it, and I mean it doesn't always work, but I guess it's part of the experimentation and the progression of trying to create something new and something that's got meaning with the clay or the materials that you're using as part of the materiality.
How they interact.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. And Gaia, just again to kind of return back to your works and this idea of belonging or otherness, how do you feel you transpose this feeling into the canvas? It's such like an
question.
That's a very big question. I feel like is it such an intangible feeling, or maybe to start with, how do you approach a work to how do you begin? Is it a sketch? Is it kind of the grounding of the work? Is it very free, how you build up the canvas to transpose that feeling? Maybe that's a better place to start.
That's okay. Do you know what? You'll just have to understand this might be a round question. I'll come back to it. Yeah. Probably in terms of thinking about how to provoke those feelings, I don't really I mean, I hope you try and paint something and you're thinking about that thing, but there has to be a reliance on the viewer to kind of have an experience of their own. And I think that's something that's interesting. It's always nice when someone sort of comes up to you and they speak to you about having the experience that you had when you were making it, and that's such a pleasure. In terms of trying to do that, I look a lot at older work and read quite a lot as well about people who have made work that kind of evokes that sense of the sublime or loneliness and things. In terms of the sublime itself, basically people will often interchange the word sublime for things like beautiful. You know, people will say, "Oh, that jacket's sublime," and but really the meaning the meaning of sublime should have some kind of maybe fear involved in it, or like an awe, like an overwhelm. And so traditionally looking at, I mean, lots of people have tried to define it. It's one of those things that in itself is quite an intangible thing, but it is the feeling I'm kind of trying to conjure, I guess. Sure. So looking at people who've traditionally done that. Oh, and sorry, another thing is that within that feeling of sublime, it's often portrayed as a lonely experience, or an alone experience anyway, maybe that's a better phrase for it. If you're thinking about typical experiences of when people say that they've had a sublime experience, usually standing on top of a mountain, or, you know, having, if you're thinking back to art historical references,
starry sky,
exactly, yeah, exactly. And you're thinking about, it's a bit on the nose probably actually, but you know, Caspar David Friedrich's, there's that picture of him, and he's in kind of, and he's like this, but it's the back of him, and he's facing like a big mountainscape, and it's quite a famous painting, and that's usually dredged up out of Google's first page once you look for things that are reminiscent of sublime. But other people that have worked with that are people like John Martin, or who else? There was someone at Turner. And so classically they've used this sort of landscape, and what you do notice in those paintings, as I mentioned, is that there's either usually no figure, or there's maybe one. It doesn't tend to be figuration actually when people are trying to conjure the idea of the sublime. So then looking at how you can conjure that in your own work, like, you know, if you're looking at relying on non-figurative work to do that, it then becomes more of a challenge, because you can't be quite so explicit in the things that you're trying to portray, or maybe not representational is the word. So to be honest, I look a lot at those artists. Caravaggio, I love that
kind of use of lights and darks.
Love it.
As well, yeah.
Can't get enough. And then also things like the illusionistic ceiling paintings in a lot of the Italian old painters.
Yeah, because your works very much feel of that kind of like Baroque. I feel like I'm going into a church in Rome or somewhere as well.
Yeah, and it's the drama. I think that's the thing with that sort of sublime experience. I want to feel that element of loneliness in a way, but in a way that there's some kind of experience similar to how you feel when you are looking at these kind of, I think scale has something to do with that as well, actually. Yeah,
because you're also working now, you were saying you're working on a work that actually scale-wise goes. So actually, when I first saw Gaia's work was at the graduate show at the RCA, and she had this beautiful like four-panel piece that was kind of placed really high up, so you just had to look at it and kind of be drawn into it. But then it was also over the side of a balcony, so you also couldn't reach it. So it was very much like, I want to go closer, but I can't, but then it's up in the sky, and it was a really perfect location for that work, I felt. But you're also working on a piece that goes above onto the ceiling, which I think is interesting.
Yes,
expansion.
Yeah. And that graduate show piece actually, it was called Incantations to a Vague Borderland, and basically I was thinking a lot about the idea of being in this space that is neither here nor there. It's neither, you know, it's not sort of classifiable. Just back to that whole idea of the contrast and the relationship between things. And it's like, if you're thinking about these kind of ephemeral themes of the in-between, what does that look like? And so the painting that I'm working on at the moment is kind of an extension to that, both physically and conceptually as well, in that I want there to be a space that you can sort of occupy, but you are unsure about perhaps where you are, what you're between. There's no defined boundary to it aside from the edge of the canvas, obviously, but scale definitely does have an influence on that, because you can kind of enter into a work rather than it being an object, or is how I view it anyway. So I do love a big painting if I can get away with it, if they'll let me put it in the show.
And they also they have that kind of, again, drawing back on like art history, that kind of almost romantic element to them as well, which I really enjoy. But interestingly, you come, going back to the beginnings, but you're from a medical background, and I was curious in that sense of like, do you feel, people always talk about the right and the left brain, that kind of thing. Do you feel like your kind of medical background makes you kind of approach a canvas in a mathematic way, or is it very much actually this is a completely different space for you where you're, freer, I guess, or some such?
We'll go with that.
Yeah.
Yes, for those who don't know me, and because there's some familiar faces in here, but some not, I initially trained, I did biomedical science, and then trained in medicine and worked as a doctor for about 4 or 5 years, and then sort of made the transition into full-time painting over the last couple of years or so. I always say that when I'm in the medical side, like in the medical brain, I guess, I'm trying to fix problems, and in the painting side, I'm trying to make them. But sort of making them and then having to fix them myself, so I'm really making a rod for my own back there. I think there's actually a lot of crossover, though. I think that on the surface, things seem very, very disparate. Like, it seems like it should be an opposite way of thinking. The more and more I spend time thinking about that, though, actually, there is a lot of threads between the two. I think that even though medicine in itself is largely quite almost protocol driven, or
Sure.
There's some algorithm that you kind of need to follow. And there's a lot of things that, obviously, if you're having a heart attack, you're having a heart attack. It's not really negotiable. But if it's, there's a lot in there where you do need flexibility of thought and understanding that being uncertain in a clinical environment is actually a certainty in itself. Being comfortable with being uncertain, though, is a bit of a challenge, because obviously you want to be correct. It's different from maybe when I'm making a painting. If the painting's ugly, it's ugly, we'll live. But obviously you don't want to make those mistakes when you're dealing with a person. So, but there inevitably will be, as you are a human, some limit to that certainty. And I think that has actually been quite helpful in a way when I've been entering my art practice, to accept like a level of accept the discomfort, really. Actually, it's kind of leaning in. And in terms of a scientific background, the biggest thing I've taken away from the science is just, I always say in my studios, like, just run the experiment. Like, see what happens. Yes, shove some concrete in it, be fine. Shove some rocks in, you'll be fine. Because it just is important to kind of not lose that element of play. So ironically, even though they seem very disparate, I think there is quite a lot of like dialogue between the two, and it can, one can kind of bounce off the other. So yeah.
Great. And I thought now we could actually turn to the works in the show. So I don't know, Xanthi, if you wanted to start with your works, particularly the titles, maybe how they inform them, whether the titles become before, after the piece.
I think so. Both the titles for these two works, they come from Lucy Larcom's poem in 1886. I think it was written, and she was weaving cotton in the cotton fields in Massachusetts, and wondering what role she had as a weaver in the kind of the slave trade and everything that was happening there. And she talks about women's role and how are we always subject to the loom, and are we tied to these ideas around womanhood. And I think that kind of still relates within post-colonial Zimbabwe, how women's work in terms of when you look at it broad as in childcare and cleaning and within crafts such as weaving and all of that, it's become quite a racialized space in Zimbabwe and the world over. But looking at that, where women are now being liberated enough to be able to work, but those are usually white women that get to go to work, but the other roles of caring for children and cleaning and all of that still exists, but it's just become invisible. So referencing that poem is kind of bringing it back that we still haven't moved much further away from that point when all the issues she was speaking about in 1886, they've just been changed, or the conversation around them has just changed, but they're still very much there. So I think reading all of the poems and everything gives the background of the pieces while I'm making them, and then just taking little excerpts out of the poem is how I titled these, and the other works in the wider Invisible Hand series that I made. But it doesn't always happen that way, but it generally, the references of for the titles come from books or artworks, or something that's inspired the discussion around them.
Because you had a work that I believe was acquired by the V&A, Fruits of Our Forefathers.
Yeah. So that piece, it was quite a large piece, and it had hands holding cherries, and it was referencing the kind of generational prejudices that happen in Zimbabwe within the white community, the kind of the passing down of wealth, and in Zimbabwe post-independence. So independence was in 1980, and in about 2000, before the land reform happened, all the farmland was still 80% owned by British white farmers. So it kind of showed the lack of change that had happened, and the kind of cherry picking of and privileges that are passed down. And it had kind of wax fabric around the outside of it, which is also, combining a lot of materials. And wax fabric has also got an interesting history, because it's, I think it's understood to be very African when you look at it and you think about it, and the patterns and the colors. But actually, majority of it's made in China now, and it's shipped to Zimbabwe, and people still, wear it proudly. But it's kind of, again, talks about the
kind of knotted histories.
Exactly, very knotted histories, and how capital nature and capitalism is very involved in all these discussions.
And it's interesting. I mean, jumping back to you drawing on poetry, actually, because I feel like you also draw from poetry as well, which is for very different works. It's kind of an interesting point. Whether you could actually talk about the titles of the works in this.
Of course, and it would be the only two titles that aren't ripped off from a poem as well. So the title of the larger one here is Primordial Symphony, and the smaller one is called To Be Sure of Anything, like with brackets, to be sure of its end. And they there's a nice interplay between both of them, because I don't know if anyone watched One Strange Rock, that it was like a Netflix show about the beginnings of the earth. And anyway, I have to write it down. Do you know, it's narrated by Will Smith. It's very easy watching, but they have a good soundtrack, and they have a score that's composed by Daniel Pemberton. He's a really, really good composer, and I listen to it a lot on my painting soundtrack. And so when I was in the studio, I actually had that title. I was thinking about that title. I have a list of. You just write down anything that interests you on your phone, and then before you know it, you've got just reels of probably dreadful titles a lot of the time. And I was talking to my studio mates about this painting, and I was trying to come up. I didn't want to use, the title was so good, and I was like, it just suits the work so much, because it makes me think about that sort of beginning of time, that kind of something primordial, something kind of urgent and dramatic, and the to be sure of anything, to be sure of its end, is a commentary on the idea of finitude. So it's kind of, or our experience on this earth having more value or having value because it is finite, and so the two being basically the beginnings of sort of time and this conjuring of the earth, and then commentary on the fact that, the ephemeral nature of us as humans and our lives is what makes us have an experience as humans, right? It's just the interplay between the two. But usually I will use a lot from poems, from poetry, or lines in literature. I think Virginia Woolf has some great one-liners, which I've often sort of butchered into my own versions for paintings. But these are actually the exception.
subtly changed.
Yeah.
And with both you, I mean, having you both in the exhibition, which has been so wonderful, thank you. I wonder if you had any reflections on each other's works, or even being in the exhibition. We obviously had the opening on Wednesday. Either directly each other's practice or kind of wider in the exhibition as a whole. Whoever wants to start.
Yeah,
go for
okay. Me and Xanthi met up last Thursday as well for coffee and things, so we could get to know each other's practices a bit more, which was really nice. And we were talking about the fact that with her exploring the ideas of this threading, this kind of almost forming connections, and exclusion and inclusion, I feel like there's a lot of transferable themes, I think, between both of our works, actually, even though they seem quite disparate to look at. And actually, I was telling Xanthi about this because one of my friends sent me a Klein jar, which it's quite nerdy, to be honest. It's a glass jar, but it represents a mathematical concept. There's a shape that effectively has no beginning or end and has no inside or outside. Technically, you're outside it and you're inside it. And it just, when I was talking to Xanthi about her work, is this idea of threading from the outside to the inside to the outside. It's both occupies the external and the internal at the same time. And I think that with mine as well, it's like occupying two forms at the same time. And the idea of that thread between two disparate things is really, I really like that, yeah.
Yeah, no, that was such a good observation on your behalf, because it is exactly, I think, what both of us are looking at. But I also think within the fine art canon, we're both trying to challenge traditional mediums, whereas, concrete and clay are both quite utilitarian. And I think we are both trying to bring those into new considerations and both consider ideas around aesthetic values and what's considered beautiful. So, yeah, I think there's lots of threads.
So it's nice also that fact that you guys even met up and unpacked it even further as well, because then I feel like I'm listening in on the kind of extensions of many conversations. And you both have very wide influences. I wonder if there was any kind of others that you wanted to cite in terms of maybe texts that were particularly important to you, or music or other artists.
I usually find that anything creative or fiction is more informing to me than anything factual, or it's more truthful, or shows you a more interesting experience of the world or understanding of the world. So I think generally it's books of fiction, usually written by Zimbabweans or Zimbabwean artists, that inspire me the most. And some good books to read, there's Nervous Conditions by Tsitsi Demarenga, who's amazing, and Patina Gappa, another amazing Zimbabwean author. In terms of artists, Zimbabweans are incredible. There's Moffat Takadiwa, who makes incredible tapestries out of bits of old keyboard and toothbrushes and all sorts, which you wouldn't really know, but when you look at it, they're these amazing fabrics. But yeah, generally I'd look to the creative realm. But in terms of theorists who I absolutely admire and love, there's a French political scientist called Françoise Verger, and she is amazing, and she wrote a text called Who Cleans the World, and it's well worth reading.
Perfect. And Gaia, for you, kind of any broader influences on your work, be that kind of music or text or...
So it's a bit of everything, really. But there is actually, which I would recommend, I'm not being paid by them, but there is a friend of mine actually set it up. It's a poetry and sort of music night called Outspoken, and they run events sort of once monthly at South Bank Centre. And I have a friend of mine who introduced me to this 10 years ago maybe, and honestly it's introduced me to so many contemporary poets that often are from the diaspora or underrepresented communities, and it provides they started off in a very small place in Camden Lock, and then the 100 Club in Oxford Street, and now at South Bank regularly. Very, very good. I would definitely recommend going, because I think as a cultural experience it's really enriched it's basically just opened my eyes to things and poets and writers and music that I just never would have had the chance to be honest with you, in quite an impactful way. In terms of reading, I feel like the breadth of topics that I read is quite eclectic, to be honest, and not very sensical. I like, fiction-wise, I've been recently reading a lot of Virginia Woolf. But honestly, I'll just read anything I can get my hands on, like anything. Painting-wise, I do enjoy... there's a painter called Agnes Pelton. She is an American artist who was around, most active from like 1920s to 1940s, 50s time. She basically paints these kind of, or she's labelled herself as like a transcendentalist painter, but she uses these, it actually looks very modern, the painting style, and she was a contemporary of like O'Keeffe, that kind of era. She makes these beautiful, I just think out of all the artists I can think of that conjure the sublime, she is the one. So I recommend anyone having a look at her, because I feel like a lot of people don't know of her, but I think she's starting to get the recognition that she's due. It's just taken a bit of time, as it always does, especially with women artists. So
great. To check her out. And I mean, you almost touched on it briefly, and then in terms of like community in London, both of your studios are based in London. I wonder if you could take us kind of through a day in the life of the studio practice for you, and also talk a little bit maybe about the artistic community that is here for you in London. I know you're a member of the RCA Black, and kind of if that's other important things around that for you.
Yeah, absolutely. RCA Black, I'll just touch on that quickly and then go on to the sort of day in the life of. But RCA Black is a group of, or it's an official sort of body run by the Royal College of Art that is set up to give links between current students and alumni at the RCA, and it provides just an excellent community. And honestly, I've met some of the most amazing artists who are now good friends of mine, and I think we'll probably have lifelong friendships and professional relationships because of this as well. So if anyone is considering going to the RCA, please get in touch with them. And as far as the day in the life, I actually share a studio with Lulu Stevenson, who is at the back there, and Catherine Armitage, and they put up with my nonsense daily. But normally I get in the morning, and then I have an iPad now, so I use that to sketch and things on the way. What normally happens is I'll take pictures of the work as it is at the end of the day, and then on the way in the next day, when I'm fresh, because I think at the end of the day it's going to be trash. It's just gone. My mind's scrambled. On the way in, I will then sketch onto that painting on Procreate, so that then by the time I get into the studio, I have a plan of what I'm going to work on. So there's kind of less wasted time in the studio, or less time sitting and just being like, what am I going to do? So I'm trying to get a bit better at being a bit more on it with having a defined plan, because otherwise the hours can really, really slip by. Often, to be honest with you, in the studio, we do spend a lot of time just yapping, but in a nice way. It's very constructive. We do sort of effectively like informal critique throughout the day. You know, one of us will ask the other one to come in and have a look at what they're working on, get some advice, and that relationship has honestly been so supportive, and I want to say thank you to both of you, because it really has pushed the work forward at a rate of knots compared to even at the Royal College. That was an amazing experience, but I feel like having the comfort
and consistency.
Exactly. It's really helped it move forward in a way that I'm more confident about. So
And I feel like we're similar in that sense of like that energetic exchange that you get off people can be really energizing, rather than like being left to oneself all the time. You
just get a bit weird. And then in terms of the wider community as well, we have have lots of people that went to the Royal College with us, and so there's often events and private views and things for their shows, or going to try and support when you can. Although, I mean, in London there's so much stuff on, isn't there, all the time? But yeah, it's amazing. There's always something to see and always someone to support. So yeah, it's just Nice.
And Xanthi, for you, initially at the Kiln Rooms, I mean, way back then, but then now you've moved into a new studio. I wondered if that kind of shaped you, or if you met other makers, or...
I've had a bit of a different mix of being in different... When I was at Goldsmiths doing post-colonial culture, it wasn't necessarily a creative master's that I was doing, and no one else from my cohort has gone into a creative career afterwards. It's all more theory-based, or in academia or museums or that kind of thing, which is quite nice, because it means the community that I have from that is yeah, everyone's coming from different.
It's quite diverse. In that
Yeah,
sense.
very
Yeah.
diverse.
Yeah.
And also the kiln rooms where I was first started learning how to do clay, most people were throwing bowls and plates and but they're incredible makers, but that's a whole different type of creating. So it's quite a nice community. And for a long time, I worked for a magazine called Natal Media, which I wrote all their art articles. And it was just the best way I got to interview incredible artists from all over and just ask them so many questions. And because now I'm in a studio by myself, it was such a good way to be able to, get down to the little questions you don't feel like you can ask a stranger when you've just met them. But if you're interviewing them, you can, which was amazing. But I think I love the creative scene in London. It does feel quite big, so quite hard sometimes to feel like you're a part of something. Whereas I've also got a creative community in Zimbabwe and one in South Africa, and it's quite nice to have the mix. And they're quite small and cozy, which in South Africa and Zimbabwe, and I know a lot of the people, and it's amazing because you feel really a part of something there. But then it's also nice to step out and you feel like you're in a big wide world, and there's just so many different people you can interact with and meet.
Yeah, you both have the kind of tap into the London scene, but can draw on that international network as well.
Yeah.
And I wondered, do you have any kind of, what's the next step for you? What's the kind of upcoming projects? I'm excited to see what's next.
Last year, I won a prize for female African artists, which
Wonderful.
was a privilege. And as part of that, I get to do a residency back in South Africa. And then, so I'm going in March till May to do make a body of work, and it's going to be shown in Johannesburg at the end of May. So it's super excited to go and do that.
Nice. And Gaia, same for you. What's the kind of next on the horizon?
It's a busy few months.
Yeah.
Most immediately, I have a residency in Nigeria. There's a foundation, the Yinka Shonibare Foundation, and by name it was Yinka Shonibare that set it up a few years ago, and he set up a guest artist space in Lagos in Nigeria. So I'm going to go there for a month, which should be exciting. I'm excited to kind of get in touch with some artists who work with different textiles, clay, a range of things really, because I kind of want to use it as a way to just learn more about Nigerian contemporary art and how that kind of sits in or speaks to, I guess, like the Western canon as well, or more of a wider context of that. But I'm really excited about that. It should be good. And then after that, I have a solo show with LBF Contemporary, which is in Fitzrovia. They're a great gallery, so please come down. I will give details and things about the dates of the show, I think mid-May-ish, but
Nice.
yeah, should be fun.
And this is a bit of a big question, but I feel like it's nice. It's a nice one that I like to come back to with artists is, what would be a dream project for you? Kind of this idea of like manifesting something to happen in the
Tate?
future. Yeah. Tate, if you're listening.
If you're listening, Turbine Hall.
Yeah. Be that 5 years time, 10 years time,
Yeah.
or if there's a residency in another country you'd want to do, or just I mean, you could leave it at Tate if you want.
Let's go with Tate. Yeah. Do you know what? There are so many residencies I'd really like to do as well. I think I just want a holiday as well. But there is the Joseph and Annie Albers Foundation. They have a residency in Connecticut, which I think I would like to apply to. That looks pretty good. And they also have another one in Senegal as well. So my mum lives in the Gambia, so it's a quick trip to Senegal, which would be nice. But yeah, dream-wise, I'd love to work somewhere where they gave me free rein to do sort of more installation work, because it's been fun doing. Well, we'll see. Yeah. Let's see how the May one pans out first, and then we'll go from there.
And Xanthi, same question for you. If it was a kind of unlimited idea.
Well, for me, working with ceramics, you're quite controlled by the size of your kiln with what you can make. So for me, the facilities are all I can dream of, is just having a place that's got huge walk-in kilns. And there are a few incredible residencies that do have those facilities. There's one in LA and at Berkeley, and one in Guadalajara in Mexico, and both just would be dream to be able to just go and just build massive things. So yeah, that's on my top to-do list.
Yeah. And then last question would be, if there are any, because we have an education department at the October Gallery, which I'm very passionate about supporting. So as an artist, established artist yourself, what would you say to kind of a young upcoming artist as a kind of message about maybe finding their own voice, or just any kind of guidance, I guess?
Yeah, authenticity is such a big thing of what you've got to try and find, and it's really hard. And I think how you try and find that is, I struggled quite a lot at art school, just because you had to have, every 2 weeks, you had to have a finished project that was done, that was marked, that people critiqued. I mean, it's great to learn critique, but I found you weren't given the space to make bad work.
There's too much pressure on it, isn't it, really?
And I think you really need to be able to allow yourself to make work that's not good, to make the work that is good. Because if you keep trying to make things that are finished for projects that are, you know, you're so pressured by the outcome, you're not going to experiment as much or innovate as much or feel that excitement of just not worrying how it's going to turn out. So I think my advice would be to just make bad art, and you'll eventually make good art from it.
And similar, Guy, would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, do you know, a while ago, I don't know who said this, so I'm sorry because I'm not going to credit you. But someone said to actually try and make a project for yourself where you attempt to make the worst thing you've ever made, like make the ugliest thing you can think of. Because once you realise that you're trying to do something that bad, it can only be up from there.
Yeah.
That's not my advice, but that's someone else's. My personal advice would be, just do it. Just honestly do it. Doesn't matter how weird, do the thing, run the experiment. And you just have to, I definitely get this from my dad, I think, as well. It's like, if you're going to do something, just do it to the best of, like, put your all in. Like, don't mess about. So mess about, but put your all in while you mess
whilst
about.
You're doing it. Yeah. Dedication to it. Thanks. We're now going to go to the audience, so it'd be great if anyone has any questions. We have a free mic that's going to come find you.
Yeah, it's a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much. But I was interested to know what your relationship with your training has been. I mean, you both mentioned universities, and have you had that sense of having to reject what you've been taught or what you've been expected to actually find your own outsider creativity?
I think for me, I definitely did, because I studied my undergrad in fine art, and I haven't pursued anything. I mean, I majored in printmaking, and I haven't really done that since. And I think when I first started playing with clay, it was that exact thing of not feeling the pressure and the outcome of what you had to make, and it became a space where you were being more experimental and more creative. So I definitely found that breaking away from, maybe that would happen anyway if you just pursued it again without the schooling structure around you. But for me, it definitely helped to not feel the production, reel going.
Thank you. That's a great question, actually. Because I did the MA, which is only a year, I didn't really have an undergrad in art, where I think people tend to cut their teeth on this more didactic teaching strategy, I suppose. For the RCA, it was very much self-directed, actually. I mean, I think more of the discussion was maybe some critique and tutorials, but there wasn't much actually being forced upon you, I felt like. So in some ways that's, at the time I actually thought I'd be going to the MA and getting a lot of teaching. But the teaching is just not in the way I had imagined it. So if anything, when the challenge I found was more learning to defend my position in a way. And I thought that was very necessary. I think, if you hadn't been in an environment where it's been an academic environment in terms of art, you just don't really have the skills equipped to really question why you're doing what you're doing. You just, a lot of the time, I know I certainly didn't have rationale. You're just kind of feeling your way, which is also fine. But it did force me, for better or worse, to be able to kind of think about it more deeply. So I didn't have too many. I had one time where I had to sort of reject something, but even then, actually, it just helped me strengthen my own position rather than it being an onslaught of that sort of thing. So overall, I didn't feel like I had to fight too much, but maybe other people had different experiences.
Both of you seem really confident about where you're standing as artists. Oh, thanks. Both of you seem very confident about where you're standing as artists, and you seem to have been quite firm within your within the media that you've chosen to use to actually state who you are and where you're coming from and what you want to do, without it actually necessarily being part of some other narrative.
I'm glad you feel that way. the weeping is inside.
Somebody else's narrative.
Yeah, I think it is quite difficult to stand in the face of reason and say, no, I'm going to do something different. But it's probably out of naivety, though, to be honest. You know, if you've been doing it for long enough, then by the time someone challenges it, you're like, well, I'm here now. You know, so I think it's a bit less... I think maybe if I'd had more of a traditional, you know, gone into a BA and then straight into MA and I think you probably would be more...
Yeah, it's interesting because you both kind of have this fusion, I guess, of you kind of only coming to the painting and the masters. I mean, painting before, obviously, but then in kind of that traditional sense of art school in the masters, and then you kind of also doing the masters in post-colonial theory. So it's kind of interesting that you're both kind of very much merging or approaching it in a interdisciplinary way that I guess resists that foundation BA masters kind of traditional trajectory of art school, so to speak.
Also, med school will harden you up to humiliation.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think for me, I'm glad I sound, or you think that we're confident, but I think it's taken time, and it's definitely been, I mean, finished art school 10 years ago, and this has been, you know, a slow thing that comes about. And I think when I finished undergrad, you think you're going to know what you're going to do straight away, and you find the thing that's going to be your practice, but it definitely didn't work that way. And it definitely took the last 10 years to find the thing that I want to talk about, that I'm passionate about, and create the work that I want to create. And I feel like I am on that track now, but it's definitely it hasn't just happened.
First of all, thank you for that riveting conversation. And this is a question for Gaia. Given your cultural background, you mentioned how your father's from Jamaica and your mother's from West Africa. Now, you also mentioned about, you know, abstract art and loneliness, and how do you create that sense of structured feeling to help you make sense of who you are, given the fact that you're stuck in this space between a middle passage, or this third space, like you said, liminality. How do you make sense of who you are through that structured feeling, given your cultural background, you know, the Caribbean and West Africa? Because, you know, usually people who are from different backgrounds struggle with loneliness and confusion and a fragmented sense of identity. So how do you create that structure now through the abstractions and find meaning from that?
So my dad's Jamaican, but my mum, she lives in West Africa,
Right.
But she's from the UK.
My apologies.
So, yeah, no, it's fine. Just because in terms of cultural influence, that isn't, you know, that wasn't present when I was growing up from a West African standpoint. Yeah, I that's a great question. That is exactly what I'm trying to do. I think it's quite difficult because, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of going from more of a figurative or representational practice to an abstract practice, it does bring that question of how you do portray an emotion or a feeling, or that like you said, that sort of fragmented identity. It means that you can't be explicit, and I think that is a challenge that I don't really know. I think it's just looking at how maybe other artists have dealt with that as well, and what applies to you and what doesn't apply to you. What you can take. I mean, there's nothing you can do as an artist, I think, that you're not referring to something or using another artist's ideas or approaches, because we are kind of, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, right? There are people who have been exploring these kind of themes for centuries, decades, thousands of years. So I think looking at contemporary artists who are dealing with maybe like identity issues in terms of diasporic or feelings of not belonging, being sort of placed in other environments. For me, that is directly manifested in the way that I'm putting the concrete onto the paintings and things like that. So yeah, I'll have a think about that, because this is what I'm trying to do. So we'll see, yeah.
Hey guys, is that on? Yeah, good. Hey, hi. Yeah, I love the conversation. This is really cool. I kind of wanted to piggyback off of the first question about education. So both of you, at least the impression I'm getting is that you quite like the idea of residencies and kind of exploring or having spaces that facilitate you exploring more of your work and yourselves. If you were to, now knowing what you know and what you've experienced in education and in residencies and with your own work, if you were able to structure your own year-long education system just for yourself, do you know what that would look like?
Go Xanthi first, go for it.
I mean, that's a great way to think about structuring a new way of learning. It would be so helpful, I think, especially, I think definitely in undergrad where you're given such structure. I think it is different when you do a postgrad in art, but I think it would be so helpful to be, taught, as you said, you were wanting to be taught, but you were, guided in different areas. But I think you find that self-exploration when you're put in a residency, because you're usually with a couple of other people. You have to learn, how to converse and have dialogue with a group of artists and in a different place, and you're learning different skills than you would in a structured educational environment. So I think if you had a year long to combine the two would be incredible. If you could have 6 months being led and taught, and then 6 months teaching yourself through your own exploration and learning, that would be such a great way to structure a year. I don't know if that answers your question. Both. I wouldn't give up either of them. I'd want both.
Thank you, Lee. That's a really good question. I'm trying to do it now. Do you know what I mean? I'm trying to do that strategy. I'm trying to enact it. So I think my ideal would be similar to you, is having that sort of cross-disciplinary, or just an environment where there are other artists. It's nice if people are doing things that you're not, because I think you do get that sort of cross-pollination between different approaches. But I think that could be, and that could just be in your studio as it is, if depending on the setup you have. But I agree, I would love a sturdy residency, for a few months, because I think you really need to get your teeth in, and then some sporadic, more structured teaching sessions. So perhaps if you had professional, someone that could sort of come in and give you almost a more didactic tutorial every now and then, just to kind of change the way you're thinking a bit, and then critique with other artists, and then lots of exposure to seeing other art. So I think making a concerted effort to go out to museums and to go out to other people's shows and things like that, and maybe guided, I don't know, this doesn't exist, but maybe some person who could come in and sort of hand select things for you to read and look up, do you know what I mean, based on your practice.
I guess that's almost a curator's job in a way, so to speak. Thanks.
Thank you. It was really good, all three of you. It was very, very good listening. You, Xanthi, you used the word passion, and you said at last you found your passion after 10 years, I think you said. It always seems to me that if you don't have the passion, you won't get to where you need to get to, because it's what drives you. And the thing you're talking about over and over again is bringing in oppositions, things in your lives, things you want, things. And there's a wonderful word called littoral, which is where oppositions meet. So the sea meets the sand and all that sort of thing. What do you think about edge in your work, the meeting of oppositions? Because it seems to me that that's what you're talking about a lot of the time.
Oh, for me, I love the edge. The edge is where the interesting stuff happens. The edge for me is probably actually more of is analogous to that thing, I think, for me, of that relationship between the two. So that precipice where you are having that, like I said, that sort of conceptual third meaning of two things that are different. So yeah, that's a very good way of thinking about it. Yeah, I would say that's exactly how I would think about the edge. Yeah. Yeah,
I think I call the edge the fray, because I think of weaving. So I always think of trying to flesh out what happens in the fray of a fabric or what we're leaving out of the fabric. And I think that is what's interesting, especially when I was looking at Invisible Hands. So it's almost, I guess, where the edges where two things meet, but this is what you're trying to bring out what exists in it that you can't see. So it's almost, I like to think of it more like a fray or the missing parts of the story.
Any other?
Bravo to you both. And it's wonderful to hear you speak about the dualities in your work, tradition, contemporary, the baby and the carriage and the lion, where these juxtapositions of visual ideas or ideas together produces something third. And the reason I'm saying this is because our next show is devoted to William Burroughs, who created what he called in that space, that third space, the third mind. And something new, unexpected, and revelatory happens in that space.
That's amazing, actually. It's bang on.
Any further questions? Yeah.
Congratulations to all of you and to the October Gallery for putting on a very fine show. You both talk as artists, and your very discipline is a solitary one, though you are keen to relate and get feedback from other artists. I'm just curious, if you had the opportunity to collaborate with another artist or another art form, what would that be?
I haven't had much chance to collaborate. I think the most collaborative space I've been in is in a residency program where you put with the other artists and you get to have the conversation and all of that. But the solitary life of an artist is something that because I work on my own in my own studio, so I've got myself a dog to keep me company. But I find it's one of the hardest parts of this profession. You're in a shared space, but it's quite hard for me to be in a shared space. I make quite large things and it's dusty and it's messy. But I find it's something where you've got to get so much energy to be motivated because there's no one else to kind of push you along or to keep you going. And it's I think the one thing I struggle with most is trying to find, like, you don't want your motivation to be to get you to the studio. You need your motivation to be to make the work in the studio. So I find structure so helpful in that way. So you've got your, it sounds quite rigid, but your rules of your studio, and you have to be there by this time and stay this time and make this much. And I find that so helpful in terms of then being able to cope with finding your motivation in other ways. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, the solitude thing is something that I have to live with and deal with a lot.
Well, I just speak partly from experience because I trained as a painter printmaker. I went through a rather formal form, which was excellent, and learned skills, but actually shifted away from that. And though I work in the studio, and that discipline and that relentlessness has to be there, it's actually combining that with other artists. They may be performers, or it could be on set design. It's actually using your experience and your background to highlight other art forms which you could do so well. So you don't change that internal struggle, but you're actually doing it with others who are doing the same thing and bringing something together if possible. Outdoor arts or in performance music, or not about playing the instrument. I have seen an extraordinary artist who uses clay in a performative way on the stage, and your love of clay and the way you also manipulate it reminded me very much of that artist. And
amazing. Please let me know who it is. I'd love to see.
Don't know, Guy, if you wanted to also say.
I haven't really collaborated with anyone, but it'd be quite formally. I feel like every day in the studio is a collaboration, whether they like it or not. But there's been no sort of formal projects. I think the closest I've come to is designing I have a pianist and composer friend who did the album cover for. I feel like that's as close as I've gotten to doing some kind of cross-disciplinary thing. I think if the right project came about, or a person that we have a bit of dialogue together, I think that would be quite interesting. So eyes are always open. If anyone has any suggestions, let me know. Yeah.
Hello. I'm just wondering, because there's a lot of conversation about the knowing, and I'm just wondering what part, where does the mysterious, the unknown, and the not knowing exist within your practices, your wonderful practices?
Everywhere, everywhere. I think that every day is a bit of a leap of faith almost. Because even if I suppose it depends on your practice, but I imagine it's the same with yours as well, is that there's so much chance involved in the making. So even if you can obsessively plan something, it's never, the minute you put the paint on, it's never the same as you planned. Every single brush stroke, every single decision is a risk, and it's a step into accepting a level of loss of control, I think, for me.
Yeah, I think I'm very similar to that, whereas I'll do a sketch to start off, but it never, ever, ever turns out like the sketch. But that's a great thing that happens, because it's, each stage of working with clay informs your next stage. And I think it's, the whole process of making something with clay usually takes a couple of months. So, depending on how much water's in the air that day, or how dry it is how quickly it'll hold its shape in terms of, and how patient I'm being that day will, whether it's this shape or this shape. So I think the unknown for me is every day. But I love that. That helps me make better work, I think, because I'm not trying to get to an end point.
Thank you. Lovely to hear all that you've been saying. It's a question really for you, Gaia, in the sense that you use the word sublime. And sublime's a very difficult word, and I don't think that people actually know what it means today. But even in Byron's day, Byron could use sublime. He's mocking the fact that it doesn't mean anything, to make the word Miltonic mean sublime. Yeah. So even in the 1800s, it was a word that you played with. Now, when you say that in your work you're trying to reach sublime, that use of the word takes in a whole amount of study to know what it might have meant once. And I don't think anybody today actually understands the word. So what I'd wonder is, rather than using a word sublime, which is a reference to other references, what do you think the thing that you are trying to touch is? And I found it very interesting that you used the word edge. Because for a contemporary who comes to your work, who has no idea about Miltonic, sublime, turn of the 18th century, the 17th century, what is it that you want that contemporary person to be feeling? You mentioned John Martin and things like that. Those are very much culturally located in time. But edgy, what is the word that you would drop in, instead of using this archaic term that was never really properly understood by anybody?
Yeah, it's interesting, because there's quite a lot of, well, not a lot, there's a few people who have written about the idea of the sublime, as I'm sure you probably know. Like Kant talked about sublime, but that was very, very dry. And Edmund Burke wrote a book about it's like a philosophical inquiry into the sublime and the beauty, something. It's a long title. But he basically, categorized it as more of a, where there is something, perhaps it's beautiful, but there is this element of fear from a position of relative safety. Terror, terror. And I think that does encapsulate it in that sense, but I think the meaning of the word sublime has changed somewhat, or like, as I said earlier, about people using it interchangeably with the idea of beauty. So I don't think I've found a word that encapsulates it. I think that for me, the idea of conjuring that sublime in that sense makes sense, but the way it's used now is, maybe you're right, a bit archaic, perhaps doesn't actually conjure what you're trying to. So I don't know, if anyone has any suggestions, that'd be great. The edge.
I love this word, edgy. I mean, today we today people have explored different kinds of drugs and things. People know that feeling of absolute shock in front of a very ordinary object, that you suddenly see it again. But I mean, since you're the person trying to elicit that response or trying to put that response on the canvas, I rather than using the word sublime, I'd be interested to know what it is that you are thinking. Terror, shock, horror, fear, they're all different parts, and sublime, I don't think, is a word, although it's often talked about. It's a word behind which people have hidden, and I would say for centuries. And you talk about Burke, and this is why Byron mocks the word, because nobody knows what it means, and everybody's trying to say my work is sublime. So it's a very old question about artists hiding behind the word sublime.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, because I think that probably just shows my inability to correctly articulate what I'm trying to say effectively. But I think the problem is with art in general, or definitely my own paintings, is that in the painting is what I'm trying to communicate it through the painting, and so then it becomes this kind of false. You're
who needs
trying
the
to
words kind of
who
thing.
needs the words, yeah.
Exactly.
But in this day and age, you do need the words, because the audience demands that of you in some way. So I think that, I think in lieu of that, probably that kind of the overwhelm maybe is probably the thing I'm most attracted to within the scope of the definition of the sublime. But I think it's something to think about. So thank you. But I don't know. So.
Yeah, it feels very like that liminal space. And to me, when you said sublime, I think of, I'm not a religious person, but I think of religion. It's like that you're trying to find some kind of leap of faith to the unknown, which I think of when I look at your paintings. I feel like there's the unknown or some kind of religious aspect to it without it being tied to a specific religion in any way, but that feeling of trying to find the space that you can't see, or the liminal space.
It's difficult because what I like about what I'm trying to aim for is the thing that is not describable. So in itself, it's a misnomer that you just can't. And
it kind of shifts. I feel like in your kind of artist bio as well, is the word quasi belonging, which is too static for what we're kind of talking about, but in that sense of that shiftingness as well. So maybe
something in flux, maybe something. It's really hard to pin down. But the problem is when it is that intangible, how do you describe the intangible? I don't really know.
We had another question over here, and then we'll come over there. Yeah.
Oh, maybe somebody else should have it, because I've already had one.
That's okay. You can have another.
Well, I mean, if I can just do it. I was just really intrigued by what you said about the your post-colonial and colonial and post-colonial experience and heritage. And you mentioned a statue of Cecil Rhodes, I think. And there's a lot of talk now about the monument and the sculpture's monument and questioning it. And I'm a sculptor. I've been working with Ukraine sculptors who are questioning exactly that whole issue. How do we make contemporary sculptures which symbolize a country but are not falling into the trap of whatever, And I just wondered whether you thought about that, whether you thought about your ceramic pieces pushing aside the Cecil Rhodes pieces and kind of creating another kind of sense of national identity.
It's scary because national identity always comes with a motive of some sort. So it's hard to be tied to that and represent that. But I think the public space and changing how the public feel in a space is so linked to what's within it and the sculptures. And obviously they need to be, you need to think about that deeply. But I think what I'm more interested in is how this whole dialogue with what's happening in the public space has become so prominent. But I think when I'm working with clay, what I find even more interesting is that we're not talking about what's in the domestic space or within the private. And those objects, they're not inert either. In Zimbabwe, we still have, tea sets and high tea, and we have gravy all over our meal at Christmas because it's meant to be snowing outside and that kind of thing. And I think all these traditions that exist within the private space also need to have a new way of thinking about them. So I think I'm more inclined to, especially with using clay as such a domestic utilitarian object, I think I'm trying to understand that side more. But it's hard to know what the right thing is, because I'm sure what will happen. Well, I quite like the idea of the plinth, the changing plinth. So you have something that represents you for that time. It's not going to last forever, but it's chosen by the people and it's erected, and then it changes and it's porous and plural. I think erecting monuments that are meant to stand there for the rest of time is never going to please everyone forever.
We had another question at the back.
Yeah, just on the word sublime, just as someone who speaks a couple languages, I just think maybe sometimes the English language can be quite limiting in its in the scope in which we can really describe a feeling, whatever. Like in Mandarin, there's so many different ways of saying happy, depending on the context and all these kind of things. So just going back to the maybe not knowing exactly how or having the word sublime really define your work. I was thinking maybe you can look at beyond English, the English language, and look at other languages, especially given the global South and post-colonial or pre-colonial languages, very rich in how they describe human emotions, and it goes beyond just that word. I think of even the word hiki. What's that?
I know what you mean.
Yeah,
like H-I-G-G.
That one. Yeah. You can't really describe it in English, but it's a word that exists to describe a feeling of feeling cozy. You have to describe it. We don't have a word for it. So just when you were talking about that, I was just like, I've got the idea. Maybe, looking at other languages in particular. So I don't know what that would be, but yeah. Maybe Wolof, since your mum's in the Gambia, I think they speak Wolof.
Yeah, it's a great shout, to be honest. Because if I have friends who English isn't their first language, they'll often say things like, "There's no word for this in English, but it roughly means this," or there's not direct translation. So it's a really good idea, actually. Thank you.
And any others? We could probably take one more if we have someone. Yeah.
I suppose it's quite a difficult question, really, because I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm a white Aotearoa New Zealander, so in a way I sort of have some degree of connection to some of your story. But what I'm wondering is what are your thoughts regarding? It sort of jumps into a minefield, but regarding relationship to the traditions of a people and a land, and your relationship with ideas surrounding cultural appropriation, and surrounding identity, and surrounding speaking for yourself and speaking to others. It's not so much a challenge; it's more of it's a question. Yeah.
I find that's something that I really want to locate myself, or understand how I locate myself, and I don't want to speak on behalf of anyone else or for anyone else, but I think it's a mistake to not acknowledge that I'm part of a history, and to when I'm speaking about basket weaving in Zimbabwe, I don't want to speak for those basket weavers, but I want to speak about the fact that my father is a fifth generation Zimbabwean and went there not as a farmer, but his history is there, and contemplate that history. I don't think you can ignore it, or you can pretend that doesn't exist. And I think what I can do is address my white community in Zimbabwe who ignore all of these things, and that's who I'm speaking to when I create the works who I'm thinking of when I'm creating the works, as opposed to trying to appropriate something for a different purpose. So I hope that comes across, but I know it's a really tough one, a tough line where a lot of it is not my story to tell, and it shouldn't be, but I still have a part in that history and want to understand it and be able to express things about it.
Thank you so much. Last one. Sorry, right across the other side. Last one, and then we'll finish. Thank you.
It's not a question, it's just to share that today there's a conference on at Conway Hall, There's an exhibition in Conway Hall, which is a mixture of, there's a colonized and a colonizer artist, and they are doing some work on there. I just thought that maybe it would actually be interesting for some of the people here. So it's not on for very long. It's, as I say, it's a small doll that was made by sorry, I just thought maybe you're interested in going to that, in terms of it might fit with some of the things you were just talking about just right there.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. So that kind of wraps us up. Thank you so much for coming, everyone, and please enjoy the rest of the exhibition. Have a look around. Say hi to the artists whilst they're still here.
Thank you, everyone.